Have you ever found yourself at a place where everything you believed in, every promise you trusted, simply fell apart? Bellstar Mayfield had. She stepped off the train with nothing but a worn satchel and a heart full of hope. The wind was cruel, that day, kicking dust into her face as she looked around the desolate station. No welcoming arms, no familiar face. Only silence and the sharp, curious gazes of strangers. She stood there, alone, clutching her bag tighter, not shedding a tear. Because crying would have meant she still believed he might come back for her, but deep down she already knew he wasn't coming. The man who had written 6 eager letters promising marriage and a fresh start had vanished, taking with him every word he once penned. Can you imagine that kind of abandonment? Betrayal at the end of a journey you thought would be a new beginning? But Bellstar didn't collapse. She didn't turn around. She didn't beg. Instead, she stood tall, her pale lavender dress dusty from travel, her face calm but resolute. It's hard to say whether it was courage or sheer stubbornness, but maybe they're the same thing when the world tries to break you. As she shifted her heavy trunk, borrowed, chipped, and bearing more than just physical weight, 2 young boys tumbled off a nearby freight cart. One of them stumbled right near her, squinting up with the innocence only a child can offer. "You the new school teacher?" he asked. Bellstar shook her head. "No, I was supposed to be someone's bride." The boy blinked, confused. "Is he late?" She managed a soft reply. "No, sweetheart, he's not coming." That's when Boone Carter appeared, a man carrying the weight of his own storms. He wasn't flashy or loud, just a man in a worn coat, with dust on his boots and years of hard living in his eyes. He didn't offer sympathy or empty words, just a quiet presence. Sometimes that's more powerful than any speech. After a few minutes of conversation, Boone did something unexpected. He made her an offer. No, not a rescue, not charity. He offered her a chance. "My name's Boone Carter," he said. "I've got a farm up north, 2 boys, a good horse, and a roof that needs patching before the rain season. Wasn't planning to pick up anything more today than nails and flour. And yet here we are." Imagine being offered a life with a man you barely know. A life not promised in poetry, but in calloused hands and quiet promises. Not flashy, but real. Bellstar didn't answer right away. She asked him, "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm not asking, I'm putting it plain," Boone said. "You don't have to say yes." There's a certain kind of dignity in that, isn't there? In a world quick to offer pity or judgment, here was a man simply offering partnership. Not saving her, not pitying her, just standing with her. Bellstar looked at the life she'd been handed. A man who abandoned her, a dusty station, a town full of whispers. And she made a decision. She said yes. The wedding was quiet. No flowers, no music, no friends from back home. Just a preacher, 2 boys clutching wildflowers, and a vow whispered in a dusty chapel. Bellstar's voice trembled only once when she said, "I do." But it wasn't out of fear. It was a choice. Have you ever had to choose hope over humiliation? Strength over shame? Bellstar did. What strikes me about her story is not that she found a man, but that she found herself. She didn't wait for someone to sweep in and save her. She chose a new path with her own 2 hands, dusty as they were, and Boone, he didn't marry her to fill a hole or patch a broken heart. He chose her because he saw something most people didn't: resilience. Grace under pressure. The kind of strength that doesn't shout or demand attention but holds steady when the world cracks around you. Maybe that's the kind of strength we all need more of. The quiet kind. I think about Bellstar a lot when life doesn't go the way I planned. When something I pinned my hopes on falls apart. Her story reminds me, you can be left at the station, heartbroken and alone, and still find a way forward. Not by pretending the pain didn't happen. Not by forgetting. But by choosing, deliberately, bravely, to stand up, dust yourself off, and walk toward a life you didn't expect but might just deserve. Because sometimes, the life we think we want, the one full of promises and perfect, Plans isn't the life we're meant for. Sometimes the best things in life come not from being chosen, but from choosing back. Have you ever had to start over when everything you counted on fell apart? What would you choose? Fear, or the messy, uncertain hope of a new beginning? Bellstar's story isn't just about a woman left at a train station. It's about all of us every time we're abandoned, rejected, or left behind. It's about the quiet power of standing your ground, of saying yes not because life handed you what you asked for, but because you were brave enough to reach for what comes next. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of courage that changes everything. Starting over. It's a phrase we hear a lot, but we don't really talk about what it feels like. Not the excitement of a clean slate, but the heavy, awkward silence that comes when you're suddenly living a life you didn't plan for. Bellstar. Mayfield knew that feeling all too well. After a quick, quiet wedding to Boone Carter, a man she barely knew but who offered her something rare, respect, Bellstar found herself on the back of a wagon, rumbling away from the town that had watched her with judgmental eyes. She wasn't riding toward a fairy tale ending. No, she was heading into the hard, unfamiliar landscape of reality. The farm wasn't much to look at. A sagging roof patched with mismatched wood. A porch that leaned just enough to notice. Chickens. Scattered at their arrival, a tired dog barked twice before settling back down. Inside, it smelled like smoke, pine soap, and bread that had been forgotten in the oven just a little too long. This wasn't the life she imagined when she boarded that train months earlier. But life rarely gives us what we imagine, does it, Boone? Didn't try to sugarcoat things. He showed her the hooks where she could hang her coat, where the water was kept, where to find matches. His movements were slow, methodical, like a man used to living with ghosts. And maybe in a way she was one more he would have to learn how to live with. That first night they ate beans and cornbread by the fire. His two boys, Emmett and Samuel, watched her with wide, uncertain eyes. Bellstar wasn't sure what they saw. A stranger? A threat? Maybe just another person who might leave. When she tried to take their plates after dinner, little Samuel flinched. Bellstar paused, careful. "I won't hurt you," she said softly. Boone caught her eye. "They ain't used to kindness yet. Give 'em time." Kindness. It wasn't loud here. It didn't come wrapped in pretty words or grand gestures. It was a quiet thing, setting a plate gently on the table, hanging clothes on the line, mending a torn shirt by firelight. Bellstar wasn't their mother. She knew that, and they knew it too. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to orbit, closer, and so did she. There's a certain vulnerability in starting over and stepping into a life where nothing is familiar. Bellstar was a woman who had been told she was too much, too big, too loud, too honest. And yet here, among cracked walls and fields bristling with wild grass, she was simply enough. The days fell into rhythm. She learned how to gather eggs without getting pecked to death. She wrestled with stubborn goats who seemed to know she was an amateur. She sewed patches into shirts that had seen too many seasons. And at night, when the boys settled by the hearth, she read aloud from her old prayer book. Not because she thought anyone needed saving, but because the sound of a steady voice had a way of calming restless spirits. Boone listened, eyes closed, not praying, just present. It wasn't easy. Some mornings she wondered what she had gotten herself into. She missed the city, missed knowing what to expect. But then there were moments, small ones, that rooted her deeper than she realized. Like the first time Emmett grinned at her after a runaway goat knocked her into the mud. Or when Samuel, shy and quiet, offered her a crooked wildflower without a word. Or the way Boone would glance at her across the dinner table, not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet approval. He never demanded anything, never made her feel like she had to fill the shoes of the woman he had lost 2 winters before. "You don't have to be her," he told her once, voice low as the fire cracked. "I didn't marry you to fill a hole. I married you because you didn't cry when the world tried to break you." Strength wasn't about not feeling pain. It was about choosing to stand anyway. And slowly, Bellstar began to realize she wasn't standing alone anymore. Have you ever stepped into a new chapter of your life with trembling hands, unsure if you could hold the weight of it? Bellstar did, and what she found wasn't perfection. It wasn't the grand sweeping romance she had read about in books. What she found was better. She found a life built one small act of trust at a time. It's funny, isn't it? How sometimes the life we need doesn't come in shining armor or gilded promises. Sometimes it comes in rough-hewn porches, in goat hair stuck to your dress, in small boys falling asleep against your side. It comes in the quiet steadying of another person's presence. Bellstar wasn't sure when exactly the farm began to feel like home. Maybe it was the evening she caught herself laughing, really laughing, when she failed to catch a runaway chicken. Or the day Boone stood beside her on the porch, boots dusty, staring out at the field as the sun dropped low, and said simply, "We'll figure it out." No grand declarations, no sweeping promises, just a man and a woman, both a little battered by life, choosing to move forward together. And isn't that what most real love looks like? Not the stuff of ballads and storybooks, but the steady, enduring kind. The kind that shows up in patched roofs and calloused hands, in the simple, everyday choice to stay. Bellstar Mayfield, once left alone at a dusty station, hadn't been rescued. She hadn't been swept away. She had been seen. And sometimes being truly seen is the most powerful thing of all. So I'll leave you with this. When life leaves you standing on cracked ground, when the promises you counted on crumble, what will you choose? Will you retreat, or will you step forward, unsure but willing, into a life that may not be perfect but might just be real? Bellstar chose to step forward, and in doing so, she didn't just find a new life, she built one. Sometimes the past doesn't stay where we leave it. Bellstar Mayfield had built a fragile new life on Boone Carter's farm. Days spent gathering eggs, chasing stubborn goats, teaching two boys how to trust again. Evenings warmed by quiet fires and quieter conversations. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And for the first time in her life, Bellstar had something she could call her own. A place where she wasn't too much or not enough. She simply was. But peace, as we all know, is often short-lived. It came in the form of a letter, a scrap of paper, mud-stained and creased, carried to the farm by Boone's weather-beaten hands. Bellstar unfolded it slowly, her fingers steady even as her stomach twisted. The handwriting was sharp, familiar, and cruel. Langley Carver. The man who had once promised her a future only to abandon her at a dusty train station. The man who now wrote to say she was his property, that he was coming to claim what was rightfully his. Have you ever felt the weight of old chains trying to wrap themselves around you again? Just when you thought you were free? Bellstar stood there for a long moment, letter in hand, reading the words again and again until they lost their power. When she finally looked up, Boone was watching her, not with pity, not with fear, with the same quiet strength he always carried. "He's not going to find what he's looking for," she said, voice steady. Boone nodded. "We'll be ready." And they were. Boone mended the fences, sharpened every blade, cleaned his rifle until it gleamed in the firelight. Bellstar trained herself too, not with weapons but with will. She kept her hands busy, her mind sharper. She taught the boys what to do if strangers came. She kept an ear tuned to hoofbeats on the horizon, a careful eye on the winding dirt. But one evening Boone handed her a revolver, small, heavy, a cold secret in her palm. "You don't have to fire it," he said. "Just knowing it's there might be enough." Bellstar turned the weapon over in her hands, unfamiliar and yet somehow right. "I don't want to shoot anyone," she said. "Neither do I," Boone replied. "But if we must, we will." Preparation wasn't born out of fear. It was born out of a refusal to be owned again. And then, one afternoon, the dust rose in the distance. Riders. 3 of them. Langley Carver led the way, sitting high in the saddle like a man who still thought the world owed him something. Behind him, 2 men, hired fists by the look of them, thick-necked and heavy-handed, the kind who didn't ask questions, only followed orders. Boone was already at the fence by the time Bellstar tucked the revolver under her apron and followed. His rifle was slung low against his back, his stance casual but ready. Bellstar stood beside him, hands steady, heart hammering. Langley dismounted with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. "You must be the man who picked up my leftovers," he said, voice oily, sneering. Boone didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. "You've got no business here," he said simply. Langley smiled thinly. "Oh, but I do. That woman was promised to me. I paid her passage. That makes her mine." Bellstar took a step forward, chin high. "I am no one's property," she said, her voice clear, sharp enough to cut through the dry air. Langley's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment, Bellstar could see it. The confusion, the disbelief. He wasn't looking at the girl he had abandoned. He was looking at someone new, someone he didn't understand. "You think that ring means anything?" Langley sneered. "There was no license, no papers. She's still legally free." Boone's voice was like gravel. "Then we'll file the damn papers." The hired men shifted, uneasy. Langley's gaze swept over Bellstar. "You really think you belong here? In the dirt with these half-wild children and a man who smells like cowhide? You were meant for better." Bellstar laughed, a sharp, clear sound that startled even her. "I was meant for freedom," she said, "and I found it the day you didn't show up." Langley's face twisted, but before he could say another word, Bellstar's hand moved, quick, practiced. She pulled the revolver from under her apron and cocked the hammer. The click was loud in the silence. Langley's men froze. "I may not be a good shot," Bellstar said, voice calm, "but at this distance, I don't have to be." Boone shifted slightly, his presence solid beside her. Not shielding her, standing with her. Langley glared, but the fight had already drained from him. He glanced at his men, saw the hesitation in their eyes, the cracks in their resolve. "I'll be back," he hissed. "With law, with men. You can't hide forever." Bellstar lowered the gun slightly, but her eyes never wavered. "You can bring an army," she said, "but you'll still find me standing." For a long moment, no one moved, and then, with a sharp tug of his reins, Langley mounted his horse and turned away. His men followed, slower, their bravado crumbling behind him. The dust swallowed them as they rode off. Only when they had disappeared, beyond the ridge, did Bellstar lower the gun completely. Her hands trembled, but she was still standing. "You all right?" Boone asked, his voice low, steady. "No," she admitted. "But I'm still here." Boone reached out and brushed his fingers along her sleeve. A simple gesture, grounding, real. "You didn't just stand," he said. "You held the line." Bellstar let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She smiled. Small, fierce. "I'll need practice," she said. "My aim was terrible." Boone chuckled, low and warm. "Next time we'll shoot bottles." That night the house was quiet but not heavy. The boys leaned against Bellstar as she read aloud by the fire. Boone sat nearby, whittling a small wooden horse. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie, carrying away the dust of the day. Bellstar looked down at the two boys, safe and warm, and knew something with absolute certainty. She wasn't a woman abandoned. She wasn't a mistake to be corrected or a burden to be claimed. She was the one who stayed, the one who stood. And sometimes, that makes all the difference. When the past comes knocking, demanding you be the person you used to be, the one who broke, who gave in, what will you do? Will you hand over your peace, or will you stand your ground? Because standing isn't just surviving. It's reclaiming the space the world once told you didn't belong to you. Bellstar stood. And because she did, she found not just safety, but a life she had built with her own two hands. What will you choose when the moment comes? Sometimes love doesn't announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it's just a quiet shift, a steady hand on the wheel, a life that, little by little, becomes yours. That's how it happened for Bellstar Mayfield. After standing her ground against her past, she turned her attention back to the present. the fragile, beautiful life she was piecing together out there on the prairie. The air was sharper now, mornings kissed with frost, afternoons heavy with golden light. The land was changing seasons, and in a way so was she. At first, the boys had treated her like something temporary, like a wind that might pass through if they waited long enough. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. They watched, as she patched torn shirts, burned the cornbread once or twice, and wrestled a goat back into its pen without so much as cursing. Bellstar didn't push. She didn't demand their trust. She earned it. It was little things. Samuel slipping his small hand into hers when they walked to fetch water. Emmett leaving a crudely carved wooden flower on her bedside table. No grand declarations, just the simple, stubborn loyalty of boys who had lost too much too soon and were slowly learning that not everyone leaves. And Bellstar, she began to build more than just a home. She began to build a purpose. You see, not far from the farm were a few other scattered homes, other families clinging to the edge of the prairie. Their children, wild and half-feral, hadn't seen a schoolhouse in years. Some could barely scrawl, their own names in the dirt. Bellstar saw something in those kids, a reflection of her younger self, scrappy, overlooked, but hungry for a chance. So she did something simple but revolutionary. She started teaching. Every Sunday, right after sunrise, the children would trudge through fields and dusty trails to gather in her kitchen. They came with dirty faces, tangled hair, and eyes full of suspicion, and Bellstar welcomed them with open arms. At first, they fidgeted and whispered, more used to the whip than the chalkboard. But Bellstar wasn't interested in discipline for discipline's sake. She was patient. She showed them how to trace letters, how to add numbers, how to sit long enough to listen to a story. She read from a tattered hymnal and worn-out primers. She'd bartered from a traveling bookseller. And slowly the room filled with something new. Laughter. Learning. Hope. She didn't just teach them to read and write. She taught them what it meant to be seen, and maybe in the process she was teaching herself too. Have you ever noticed that the most profound changes often sneak up on you? One day you're surviving. The next, without even realizing it, you're living. That's how it was with Boone. Their relationship had started as a kind of truce, a practical arrangement between two people who needed each other but didn't yet know how to say it. But as the seasons turned, something warmer, deeper grew between them. It wasn't passion like wildfire. It wasn't a storm. It was quieter than that, more certain. It was in the way Boone would glance at Bellstar from across the table, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the way he repaired the roof one stubborn plank at a time, pausing only to share a coffee with her on the porch when the workday ended. It was how he gave her space without distance, how he respected the pieces of her she was still stitching back together. One evening, as the boys slept sprawled on the floor after a hard day of helping with the harvest, Bellstar and Boone sat in the porch's fading light. The horizon stretched wide and open, the last traces of gold fading into dusk. Boone didn't say much. He never did. But after a long silence, he shifted, reached out, and took Bellstar's hand. No grand speeches, no promises carved in stone. Just a touch, solid, steady. Bellstar looked down at their hands, his large calloused one swallowing hers, and realized this was home, not the roof overhead, patched and uneven. Not the fields, stubborn and dry. Not even the boys snoring softly behind them. Home was this hand, this quiet. And for the first time in her life, Bellstar didn't feel like she was settling for less. She felt like she was choosing more. Have you ever had that moment? Where you realize love isn't about being rescued or adored or even completed. It's about being chosen. Every day, in the small ways. Bellstar and Boone didn't need words to confirm it. It was in the way he brought her coffee before the sun was fully up, in how she patched his shirts without being asked, in how they faced the endless, exhausting days side by side without resentment or regret. It was love, not the kind that sweeps you off your feet, but the kind that teaches you how to stand taller on your own. Love, as it turns out, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper on the wind, a quiet porch at dusk, a life, hard won and harder kept. Bellstar Mayfield, once abandoned, once overlooked, now found herself not just surviving, but thriving. She was not the woman Langley Carver left behind. She was a teacher, a mother, a wife, and most importantly, a woman who had learned the fierce grace of choosing herself. And Boone? He didn't love her in spite of who she was. He loved her because of it. A year. It's not a long time, not when you think about it. But it's enough time for the seasons to turn. Enough time for wounds to scab over and heal. Enough time for a heart to take root in new soil. It had been a year since Bellstar Mayfield stepped off that train and onto cracked ground, abandoned and alone. And in that time, she'd built something sturdy, something real. Not a fairy tale, but a life. The house was still small, the porch still sagged, and the fields were still stubborn. But inside those worn walls, there was laughter, there was warmth, there was love. Bellstar had become more than a stranger with a borrowed trunk and broken promises. She was a teacher to the neighborhood children, a steady hand for two once wild boys, a partner to a man who had seen enough loss to know that real love isn't something you find. It's something you choose. And yet some ghosts don't stay, buried. It was a sharp morning, the kind where the air feels like glass against your skin. Bellstar stood by the window, fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching Boone shovel snow from the path. The boys were sprawled by the hearth, sketching crude drawings in the ash on the stones. That's when she saw him, a lone rider, black against the white expanse of the prairie. No dust cloud this time, no entourage. Just one man. Langley Carver, Bellstar, didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply set her mug down and latched the door behind her boys. Boone stepped off the porch, rifle in hand, but lowered. Bellstar watched from the window, steady as stone. Langley dismounted with care, no longer. The cocky man who thought the world owed him something. His coat was worn, his face red from the cold, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, cold, restless. "I came alone," he called out. His voice wasn't as sure as it once had been. Boone didn't answer. He just stood, quiet, grounded. Langley took a step closer, his breath rising in pale clouds. "I thought I'd be the one who made her into something." He glanced toward the house. But she grew roots instead. Boone stayed silent. Langley's eyes flicked back to him. "She's stronger than I remembered. I thought she'd give up, fade away. But she didn't." His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a grimace. "She owes you for that." Boone's voice was low and even. "She owes me nothing." For a long moment, neither man moved. And then, the front door creaked open. Bellstar stepped out, shawl tight around her shoulders, hair tugged loose by the wind. She walked down the steps, slow but sure, and stood beside Boone. Langley's gaze locked with hers. "If you're here to apologize," she said, her voice calm, "save your breath." Langley swallowed hard. "I'm not sorry for leaving," he said finally, "but I am sorry I never saw what was in front of me." Bellstar studied him, really studied him. Once, his words would have gutted her. Once, she would have begged for an apology, some acknowledgement that she mattered. Now she didn't need it. "I'm not sorry you left," she replied. "It gave me the life I was meant to have." Langley's shoulders sagged just slightly. He nodded, turned, and mounted his horse without another word. No grand exit. Just the quiet crunch of hooves in snow as he disappeared across the horizon. Boone let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Bellstar reached for his hand. "You didn't have to come out," he said softly. "I wanted to," she replied. "I wanted him to see." "See what?" "That I didn't disappear, that I grew, that I became." Boone looked at her, and in his eyes was that same quiet respect he had offered her from the very beginning. No rescue, no possession, just presence. You did, he said. They stood there for a while, shoulder to shoulder, as the wind whipped around them. The house behind them creaked and sighed in the cold. But inside it was warm, not just from the fire but from the life they'd built, brick by imperfect brick. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep against her sides, Boone sat whittling by the fire, his hands steady, sure. Bellstar watched the flames dance, feeling something inside her settle, roots burrowing deeper. Boone set the carving aside and turned to her. I love you, he said simply. No flourish, no grand declarations, just truth. Bellstar blinked, startled by the force of it, not because she hadn't felt it growing between them, but because sometimes the simplest things carry the most weight. You do? She whispered. He nodded. I didn't know it until I thought about what it would be like if he took you away. Not fighting, not the rifle, just the thought of living without you, and it made me feel hollow. Bellstar's throat tightened. She had spent so long believing she wasn't someone to fight for. I was afraid to say it first, she confessed. Boone smiled, soft and real. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Bellstar reached out, touched his face with fingertips that no longer trembled. I love you too, she said. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. Boone leaned in, and the kiss they shared wasn't tentative or cautious. It was a promise. Not of perfection, but of partnership, of choosing each other every single day. And in that small, worn house with its sagging roof and creaking floors, love took root, deep, unmoving, unashamed. Bellstar wasn't the woman, left behind on a dusty train platform anymore. She wasn't the broken promise or the forgotten dream. She was a wife, a mother, a teacher, a heart beating steady in the home they had built together. And if you stood on the porch that night, you would have seen the snow falling soft and silent over the prairie, blanketing the land in white. You would have seen two figures rocking, gently by the firelight, surrounded by sleeping children, dreams stitched together from loss and love. You would have seen that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields or in grand halls. Sometimes they're won in quiet rooms with steady hands and steady hearts.